Bonjour, bienvenue pour cette première masterclass pour le Whisky Live Paris 2022. On commence en beauté avec une distillerie très connue, Jack Daniels, avec le Master Distiller, Monsieur Fletcher.
Okay,
Cheers.
thank you. All right, good morning. Thank you for coming in early and sampling some whiskey. My name is Chris Fletcher. I'm the Master Distiller at Jack Daniel's over in Lynchburg, Tennessee. So it's exciting to be here, exciting to be back in Paris. It's been far too long for many reasons, but I'm very excited to be here and to be able to talk about new products from Jack Daniel's. It's something that we've been really, really focused on in the last few years, innovating and doing things a little bit unique and a little bit different in some ways, and then yet some ways very, very classical and traditional. So we have two wonderful new whiskeys to try today, and then also we'll start with our classic old number 7 whiskey, which hopefully everyone here is very familiar with as well. Before we get to the tasting, though, I'll start tell you a little bit about me, kind of how I got to be a master distiller, and my history of working at distilleries, and then also we'll talk about process and how we make our whiskeys, not only these 3 whiskeys, but the quality and the care that we take into making all of our whiskeys. And then I promise at the end we're going to taste. We'll work our way through these 3 great whiskeys towards the end. The only rule I have is if there's any questions, please ask. I don't want to leave. This is our last day in Paris, and we're headed out tomorrow. So if there are any questions that you have around what I'm saying or trying to explain about how we make our whiskey or about these products specifically, please raise your hand and ask, because this is really a great discussion over whiskey.
Si vous avez des questions, levez la main et je passerai avec le micro.
Okay, good? Ready. All right, so how did I become a master distiller? It's one of those things people are usually interested about, right? When you're sitting next to somebody on an airplane and they ask you what you do, they say, well, how in the world do you get to be a master distiller? And I tell them it's mostly luck, but I did grow up in Lynchburg, Tennessee, just right down the street from the distillery, just a few miles. And I was around the distillery as a young boy when I was little. I know that sounds a little unusual at first, but I was with my grandfather during those days. And my granddad was also a master distiller at Jack Daniel's. He started working there on January 2nd, 1957, and retired as the master distiller in 1989. And so when I was about 8 years old when he retired. So there were a lot of times in the evening he would take me into the distillery, and I get to play around, walk around. Of course, I didn't know what whiskey was, right, when I was 6 or 7 years old. And most people, when they find out about my granddad, they think that one day, he sat me down across the table and gave me a glass of whiskey and said, now this is how you nose this whiskey and taste this whiskey. And it did not happen that way at all. I did not know I wanted to be a distiller at all when I was a young one. And in fact, my grandfather didn't even give me my first taste of whiskey. My first taste of whiskey came from my grandmother. And that's a true story. When I was young, I guess my gum was hurting. I had a toothache, and she dipped her finger in a bottle of Jack Daniel's and rubbed it on my gum to get me to be quiet. So I owe a lot of it, I guess, to my grandmother and not my grandfather. But growing up in Lynchburg, has anybody in the room ever been to Lynchburg? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, maybe? All right, very good. So Lynchburg, for those of you that have not been, I'll describe it very quickly. It's a very small town. Very small. In fact, in the whole state of Tennessee, there are 95 counties. Lynchburg is number 94 in size, so very small. The town of Lynchburg, population today is a little over 600 people. There's probably, a few thousand people right here in this one building? So there's probably 10 times the amount of people in this building today than in all of Lynchburg, Tennessee. So we don't have a lot of things to do. We have one stoplight in the whole county. We don't have any supermarkets. We have a couple of small restaurants. We have no shopping malls or anything like that. But we're really good at making one thing, and that's making whiskey. And so now Jack Daniel's whiskey is sold in over 172 countries now, all over the world. And so really, as the distiller, the quality control department, reports under me, and that's ultimately the responsibility of a distiller, is the quality and the consistency of our whiskey. And if you think about a small town, mostly families, that are continuing to make our whiskey in the same way since the 1800s, as being in charge of quality control, that makes my job very easy. There's a lot of families that can date their ancestors back when Jack Daniel was alive and making whiskey, that their great-great-grandparents were making whiskey alongside him. So it really is a special place. It's a very small place, but every single drop of whiskey comes right out of Lynchburg, Tennessee, out of that same distillery. So, went away to college when I was about 18 years old. I'm a chemist by education, and I just by happenstance got a summer job at the distillery. My parents told me that I needed to get a job one summer before I went back to university in the fall. And that's when I started to learn about the process and asked my grandfather a lot of questions about making whiskey. And certainly the chemistry background helps, but it's not the only thing, right? It helps a little bit, but it takes more than that. You don't really learn distilling or making whiskey in school. But that's where my interest first got piqued. And then a couple years later, I got lucky because when I finished with school, the company was hiring for an entry-level chemist position. And it was actually located up in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky. We're part of the Brown-Forman Corporation. Several of our brands are represented here this week. And so I moved to Louisville and worked in our R&D, research and development lab. And I spent about 9 years there as a chemist, working on a lot of different things. And so after 9 years there in R&D, I spent a couple years at some other distilleries in Kentucky. And then I got a phone call from back home in Lynchburg. Had the opportunity to move back home and work for the distiller at that time, Mr. Jeff Arnett. And so I moved back home and started working at the distillery on January 2nd, 2014 as the assistant master distiller. And so that day, January 2nd, pretty special day. It was exactly 57 years to the day from when my grandfather had started at the distillery, January 2nd, 1957. In fact, I have his old office that I sit at when I'm back at Lynchburg at the distillery, and I even sit at his old desk, his wooden desk that sits there made out of course, oak barrel wood, right? So I sit at that every single day. So it's a very special thing for me to be literally in my grandfather's old office, to be in the role that he was in for so many years. And it's a really special thing for me to be able to be here and talk about how we make our whiskey. And the one thing that is very, very important to me is to be able to look people in the eye and say, we make whiskey the same way my grandfather made whiskey. Now, certainly we make more whiskey than my grandfather made back in 1957, right? In 1957, you know how many bottles we sent over here to France? 0. We didn't send anything here until the late 1980s. We didn't export a single bottle of Jack Daniels until the 1980s. So it's a very good thing that we're able to make more, but we still make whiskey the same way. So let's talk a little bit about how we make our whiskey. So the process of what we do, these spirits that we're going to taste, these whiskeys that we're going to taste, the first two are based with our Tennessee whiskey recipe or our bourbon type recipe. And then the last one, the one we'll finish with, our triple mash. That's actually a blend of 3 different whiskeys, all made, of course, in Lynchburg at the Jack Daniel Distillery. But let's talk just a minute about how we are turning grain into liquid whiskey. That is, in my opinion, of course, as a distiller, that's kind of the most important thing to me is how we make our whiskey. And I would say that the quality and the history behind our process and how we make whiskey is one of our greatest advantages. First of all, there are no secrets in how we make our whiskey. Anything you want to know about how we make our whiskey, I want you to know. We operate off of 3 different recipes or grain bills, mash bills, some people refer to them as. The Tennessee whiskey grain bill is 80% corn, 12% malted barley, and 8% rye. We also have 2 other primary mash bills that we operate on that we will experience, of course, in this blend at the end. The other 2 recipes are our American single malt whiskey, which is 100% malted barley, of course. Now, there is no legal definition of American single malt yet, but I do believe it is coming. But this is 100% malted barley, of course, coming from the one single Jack Daniel distillery in Lynchburg, Tennessee. And then the third recipe that we'll also experience in this triple mash is our rye whiskey, our American rye whiskey made there at Jack Daniel. So rye whiskey must be a majority 51% or more rye. Our recipe is 70% rye, well above the 51% minimum. There's still 12% malted barley in there, minimum 12% malted barley in every grain bill we produce. And then the balance is corn. That last 18% is corn. So those are the three recipes of the three major grain bills that we do. We do also experiment from time to time with different, grains and different grain bills, different things. It's part of the fun part of innovating and making different whiskeys. But those are the three primary grain bills that we produce. So all the grain is brought into the distillery on trucks. It's all number one quality, meaning that it's been cleaned. Right? We bring it in, we're going to grind it all on site, grind it into meal, almost like flour, but not that fine. Okay? Corn, rye, and malted barley. Now we'll take this ground meal and we will cook it in water. Okay? Not just any water. We have our own water source. Back in about 1880, Jack Daniel relocated his distillery from a farm about 5 miles outside of town to this cave spring hollow, right? At the end of the hollow there, up against the hills, there's a big opening in a cave that goes back into a big limestone cave with water that floods from underground springs. This water goes over 2 miles deep back underground. We actually have tanks to store this water just in case we ever have any bad droughts. We have over 10 million gallons of this water in tanks at any given day. We continually pump water out of that cave every single day to make sure we have plenty of water to make our whiskey. In fact, the cave makes 2 to 3 times more water than we need to make our whiskey easily. We're going to pump out about 400 gallons a minute. The cave will produce well over 1,000 gallons of water a minute, especially when we get good rain. Sometimes it rains so much it floods the cave, and we've got way more water than we want to have at the distillery. But thankfully, that doesn't happen too often. So this is very special water. We only use this water to make our whiskey. We're going to bring it into our distillery. We're going to use this to cook or mash those cereal grains that I just talked about. So the first thing we'll do, we'll cook that corn. Right? We're going to gelatinize the starch in the corn, right? It's kind of like making a corn pudding. We call it grits over in the South. I know some people may call it polenta or things, this kind of gelatinized form of cornstarch. That's what we want. That starch is what we're going to eventually be able to convert into the whiskey. So then we'll add the rye. Remember, only 8% rye in that Tennessee whiskey recipe, just a little bit for a little spice. And then we'll add the malted barley. Remember, I said 12% minimum in every grain bill, okay, because that malted grain has been sprouted. And by sprouting that grain, it will give it the power to break down the starches, mostly coming from the corn. It will break that starch down into its components, which is sugar, right? That sugar we're naturally converting from starch to sugar via malted barley every single time. It is that sugar that we're going to make from the starch that the yeast will then ferment when we add the yeast to the mixture, okay? So the yeast itself, the next part of the process, the fermentation. The yeast we can date back to at least the Prohibition time point at the distillery. Now, Prohibition ran a pretty long time in Tennessee, from about 1909 until 1938, right? So we didn't make anything during that time. Now, the Motlow family, some of Jack's nephews who restarted the distillery in 1938, we can trace our yeast back to that time, 1938, right? Now, when my grandfather first started at the distillery, to keep that yeast culture alive and growing, they would, take some of the water and some of the grain. They would make some like yeast food, right? And they'd put it in a jug, a copper jug, cap it up, and put it in the creek to keep it nice and cold. But we don't keep it in the creek anymore. We have a lab and we have a microbiologist on our staff, and she grows our yeast every single week from that same mother culture from 1938. That yeast is grown every week and brought in fresh that she brings into the distillery for our fermentation. Yeast is very, very important. You can probably pick up on that as I'm explaining this process, right? The yeast is literally going to make the whiskey in fermentation. It will make our alcohol, the very thing that makes our product. So extremely important. Secondly, it makes a lot of flavor. If you just pick up that first glass, that glass number 1, let's just nose it. Just real gently nose this first glass. This is a classic old number 7. Just start there. Just a really nice nose, just lightly. You pick up some really sweet, fruity characteristics. It's almost floral, but I get like apple peel, green pear, banana, apricot. Those are esters. These esters and these things that create these fruity, sweet aromas are really created by the yeast in the fermentation process, right? So at the very beginning, the very formation of our spirit there in fermentation, we're already starting to layer on these flavors and aromas that we identify as Jack Daniel's whiskey. So yeast is very critical, right? That's why we are growing it up with our own lab and our own microbiologist. Now, obviously, we don't have any kind of beer to taste here today, but fermentation basically makes beer, right? It's 12% alcohol. There's a lot of grain in there, mostly corn. So we have to distill it after that. So distillation for us is a 2-part process. So it's a double distillation. Okay, we have a copper column still alongside a copper pot still called a doubler. So the copper column will go first, right? That is going to separate the alcohol from the rest of that mash, right? That other 88% water, grain, solids, and things. So that will strip the alcohol out of the beer, and then it'll be blown into the doubler where it will be distilled a second time, heated, and then, of course, boiling off of the top of that pot still. That clear spirit, clear as water, we're going to condense that down into new make whiskey, as we call it, right? 140 proof, so 70% alcohol by volume. Now, this clear spirit, clear as water, if we took that spirit and we put it into one of our barrels, the federal government would require us to label our product as bourbon whiskey. But you can see, no bourbon whiskey stated on that label, is there? Okay. That's because of another process called charcoal mellowing. Now, this is, not too complex of a process. Honestly, there's nothing chemically that we measure of how we filter the whiskey through this charcoal that tells us what it does. But when we nose and taste the whiskey as it passes through, it makes a very significant impact. So this charcoal mellowing process now, let's talk about what it does, but also let's talk about what it doesn't do. Okay, first thing it doesn't do, it does not add. It's not additive. Has anybody ever used a water filter at their home? All right, you pass your water through it. On the inside of that filter, a lot of them inside, carbon, charcoal, right? When you run your water through it and it comes out, does it add color? Does it make it black or brown? Does it make it taste like coal or smoke? No, it doesn't, right? It takes things out of the water. Charcoal does the same thing for our whiskey. The whiskey goes in clear, drips through 10 feet, so over 3 meters, charcoal, tightly packed. It comes out the bottom 2 days later, looks exactly the same way. It's still clear as water. It's still 70% ABV. So, charcoal mellowing does not add anything. Well, then what does it do? What does it remove? That first glass that you just nosed a minute ago, that was 80% corn in the recipe. But when you nosed that first glass, you smelled on the aroma very, very little corn. Very little. A lot of corn oil gets blown over in American whiskeys, bourbon-type whiskeys, corn-based whiskeys, and that's part of their character, that kind of sweet cooked corn, that cereal grain note, but it's not in Jack Daniel's. That's because of the charcoal mellowing process. That's really the magic. That's what it does for our whiskey. It really reduces the grainy character of the spirit before it even gets into the barrel. Okay? Now, last thing. Charcoal mellowing does not prevent us from labeling our product as bourbon whiskey. Okay? Tennessee whiskey, by definition, is bourbon whiskey. Okay? All Tennessee whiskeys are a form of bourbon whiskey. Not all bourbon whiskey is Tennessee whiskey, right? Does that make sense? Very easy concept, right? So after the charcoal mellowing, it will go out and go into the barrel. I promise we're getting ready to taste. I know I can sense the impatience in the room, but we're going to taste in just a second. But the barrel itself, that is where all of this color is going to come from. All natural. The only thing that adds flavor to the whiskey, color to the whiskey, are the grains, you could say the water, the yeast from the fermentation, of course, and the wood of the barrel itself. That's it. Nothing else added. There's no sweeteners, there's no flavors, there's no color added. It's all grain, water, and wood. That's the only thing. So the barrel, only once used, brand new every single time, toasted and charred on the inside. Right? We actually operate 2 different cooperages, one up in Kentucky and one about an hour from Lynchburg, Tennessee in northern Alabama, where every day we make brand new barrels for Jack Daniels. Okay? This wood will come in. Our coopers, men and women that make these barrels, they raise them by hand, about 33 staves per barrel. Once they make the cylinder of that barrel, they will slowly heat the inside of it. Right, about 500 degrees Fahrenheit, radiate the heat to the inside. It's like toasting a piece of bread or like toasting a marshmallow, right? And then after about 15 minutes of that slow toast, then we'll char the inside, make it black as my shirt there. That will rip open the pores of the barrel. And so when that clear whiskey goes in, it will start to soak in to the wood and start to penetrate those pores and pull that color and flavor out of the barrel. Now, all of our barrels are aged typically between 4 and 7 years. All of these products are between 4 and 7 years. But we don't require any type of minimum age or anything like that. So at least 4, I guess you could say, but on an average between 4 and 7. Sometimes much, much longer than that, depending on the flavor of the whiskey that we want to get out. Any questions so far on the process? Anybody? No? Yep.
Do you filter also the single malt?
The single malt, what about it?
Do you filter it with charcoal?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Yep,
Right.
when it's clear. As soon as after it's distilled, we first started distilling our single malt in 2013. And so we were unsure of how we wanted to move forward with the charcoal. And so we experimented with that. And it took us a few tries. That was very challenging. But we ultimately, we decided to put it through the full 10 feet of the charcoal mellowing process, yes.
And what does it do?
What does it do?
What does it do, yeah. I mean, you explained the corn, but what about the...
Yep. With the malt, obviously with no corn in it, that doesn't happen. But one thing I think it does, it brightens it up. It almost freshens it. So with the barley, with the 100% malt whiskey, one of the things that we quickly learned is you don't have as much complexity of flavor as new make spirit as you do with multiple grains, right? It's only one grain. So the barley is not as sweet as corn. It's not as spicy as rye, right? So it's more of a neutral grain. You get a lot of more nuanced flavors on the nose. It also carries, a lot more of that kind of like toasted cereal grain, bread-like note, almost a doughy-like quality, really interesting texture and mouthfeel. What we found, though, moving it through the charcoal mellowing, it did reduce a lot of that kind of herbaceous, earthy cereal grain note to the malt itself. And another thing that we did as we were making malt whiskey is we experimented with different types of malt. Our typical malt is what we would call a distiller's malt in the U.S. So it's very low extract, very low carbohydrate, higher in protein, higher enzyme, right? That's what we have to have for this recipe, right? Yeah, and so we actually changed and started using more of a brewer's malt, a plumper, larger malt that is a little bit richer and brings more flavor really to the game is what we wanted. And then that coupled with the charcoal mellowing process that we thought really kind of brightened it up and allowed some of those more floral notes to pop on the nose, just by reducing the overall amount of that kind of grainy, grassy character that the grain inherently has. Yep. Great. Anyone else ready to taste? Let's taste. Let's jump in. I've already teased everyone with just the aroma. So let's go back to that first glass, classic old number 7 whiskey here. All right. Let's go ahead. We've already noticed it, but let's go back and we'll revisit. Again, those nice, sweet top notes, a nice bit of vanilla coming off as well, coming from that barrel itself. A lot of those kind of sweet brown notes. Go ahead and jump in. A little sip on the tip of the tongue. Just let it roll back. I really love, as soon as it hits the tip of your tongue, the fruit just pops. You start to pick up a little bit of the caramel, brown sugar, the sweetness from the barrel itself, some vanilla in the mid-palate. It rolls out to the edges. You get just a little bit of astringency, a little oak in the mid-palate, and then the finish, just a touch of spice on the back end. All right? Everything works together. There's not really one part of that dominates the other. A little sweet, a little oaky, and a little spice on the back. It's really, really balanced whiskey. I think that is one of the absolute secrets to the success of this old number 7 whiskey. One of the ways that I like to explain it, if I'm here in Europe, or if I'm back home in Tennessee, or if I'm somewhere in Asia, anywhere in the world, if I order a cocktail, let's say I order an old-fashioned cocktail with Jack Daniel's whiskey, all right? All 3 of those cocktails, depending on what bar I'm in, right, and exactly what that bartender wants to do with the cocktail, they're going to be fairly different, right? Even though the same basic ingredients are there, whatever they want to do. But I can promise you the whiskey that went into all 3 is exactly the same. We are very good at consistently making this flavor that goes into old number 7. We've done it over 150 years. And so that there's where the secret is, I think, for that, right? That flavor profile is so balanced, right? Anyone across the world, whatever they like to do, if they want to do a really, sweet application, a lot of people like to mix it with Coca-Cola. Wonderful. Jack and Coke, really popular cocktail. Classic whiskey cocktails, fantastic. Right out of the glass, just neat, just like that. A lot of sweet character going on right there in the glass. So however you like to enjoy old number 7, you can, no matter where you are and no matter what that local palate is looking for. Old number 7 can create a cocktail for that person, right? So that's really the secret, I think, to success for that product is the balance of flavor. Now let's jump over to these 2 new products, right? These are kind of the stars of the show for us. Our bonded or bottled in bond Tennessee whiskey, and then our triple mash, also a bottled in bond blended whiskey. So I think I said earlier, these new products, one very, very classic style, right? Old school style, old school American whiskey flavors, all right? And then the second, this triple mash, I don't believe there's ever been a whiskey done like this before in the history of American whiskey. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why. All right, first, let's talk the bottle and bond regulation. In my opinion, this is some of the most strict, most regulated form of whiskey making possibly in the world, certainly in the United States. So to be a bottled and bond whiskey from the United States, first of all, it must meet all requirements as straight American whiskey, right? So new charred oak barrel, the whole 9 yards. Secondly, bottled and bond says it comes from a single distiller. So you have to disclose exactly, and we do, of course, right here on the side, Lynchburg, Tennessee, Jack Daniel Distillery. Every single drop, all of our whiskey is made right there in Lynchburg. Now, that's something we kind of take for granted in Lynchburg, to be honest. But one of the reasons why we felt like a bottle and bond whiskey would be a really, really great entry for us in the American whiskey market is in the U.S. now, there are hundreds, 300 and something different bourbon whiskeys on the market. You know how many different distilleries produce those 300 different whiskeys? About 8. So there's a lot of brands, a lot of different bottles and different labels, but there's not a lot of different whiskeys. And so think about bottle and bond. This forces you to disclose. This is exactly where this whiskey is made. This is who's making it. We felt like for years we've talked about how we make every single drop of our whiskey in Lynchburg, Tennessee at one single place, the same families that have been making it for generations, and certainly that has not changed. But we felt like a bottle and bond offering would then allow us to continue to tell that message and tell it also in a more compelling way. And then especially bringing it outside of the United States, right? So the bottle and bond regulation is very much an American whiskey regulation. But you don't see a lot of these bottle and bond whiskeys across the globe. And so we felt like it would be a wonderful opportunity to continue to tell this story of transparency and authenticity that people know every single time they see that square bottle from Jack Daniel's, they know exactly where that whiskey's coming from. And then they learn about the bottle and bond regulations that requires the disclosure of exactly where that whiskey's coming from. Okay? Let's talk more about bottle and bond. Second thing, you have to select whiskey from a single distilling season. This is probably the most unusual aspect of bottle and bond. That means you have a 6-month window to pull barrels out of the barrel house to put them into the bottle. There are 2 distilling seasons defined by the American government. The spring season is January through the end of June, and then the fall season runs from July 1st through the end of December. Right, those 2 seasons. So you cannot mix barrels that were produced in different seasons. So that 6-month window sort of becomes like a vintage, right, for whiskey in some ways. Not exactly, but in some ways, right? You cannot mix. That's something that is fairly easy for us, right? Right around the first of the year, you have to be a little bit careful. You can't pull barrels from one day or the other. Or right around the end of June, you have to be a little bit careful. So after the distilling seasons, it must be aged a minimum of 4 years. Well, I just said a minute ago, right, all of our whiskeys are 4 to 7 years, so that one's fairly easy, right? All the barrels have to be aged in a bonded barrel house or warehouse. This one's also easy. That bond to the American government means we haven't paid our tax on the whiskey yet. We don't pay the tax until it goes into the bottle. Okay, so every single barrel we have aging is under a bond or a guarantee to the American government that we will pay that tax once we put it to the bottle. So that one's actually pretty easy too. And then the last thing, it has to be in the bottle at 50% ABV, right? Old number 7 is 40. These are at 50%. That is a requirement. It can't be 51%, cannot be 49%, 50% ABV. Those are the regulations for bottle and bond. The reason that we felt like a bottle and bond product would be something that the American whiskey consumer would love right now is to continue to tell the transparency and knowledge of exactly how, where this whiskey is made. So let's jump into the bonded Tennessee whiskey, that second sample. First thing I'd ask you to do, though, is to just hold it up to the light and look at the color on this one. And if you want to go back and compare it, if you have any left of the number 7, you can see this one is quite a bit darker. Definitely a shade darker. You get a little red streaking through there. I love that color. Of course, that color is barrel. So let me tell you kind of how we pull these barrels and what we're looking for the classic bonded Tennessee whiskey. This is not simply old number 7 whiskey at 50% ABV, okay? Even though it has the same recipe, 80% corn, 12% malt, 8% rye, we are also targeting barrels that will make the whiskey darker as they age. And you may wonder, well, how do you do that? Well, back in Lynchburg, it gets very, very hot in the summer. In fact, it's still very, very hot in Lynchburg now. And so what happens is in these big barrel houses, we'll have 20, 40,000 barrels in every single barrel house. In the summer, as it gets hot, all of that heat, what does it do? It rises up naturally, right? So the upper floors get much hotter than the bottom floors. And so with that heat, the whiskey inside the barrel expands much further and pushes and penetrates into the pores of the barrel to pull more color and more barrel flavor than out of that brand new charred oak barrel. That's why you get a little bit darker color. Go ahead and jump in with the nose there. You still get some of that sweetness, but there's a lot more oak backing it up, right? This is going to be the driest whiskey of the three that we're going to taste. That oak barrel, some of the tannins, right? The acidity, the astringency is going to start to come out. Go ahead and jump in. The sweetness on the tip of the tongue, as soon as it rolls back, it just explodes in your mouth. Hits the roof of your mouth, all the way out to the edges of your tongue. That's where you get that natural acidity from the barrel. You get some of the tannins from the oak. Again, a lot more barrel going on there. And then the finish, that toasted oak, a little bit of the char, almost a little hint of smoke on the back end, just a touch. We wanted this whiskey to really stand out flavor-wise from Old Number 7. We wanted to turn it up, make it much bolder, give it a lot more oak and barrel character. The focus on this was for classic cocktails, whiskey-forward cocktails. We wanted that spirit to shine through anything somebody behind the bar wanted to throw at it. Okay? Very different than the Old Number 7. So, let's move on to our triple mash. I'm going to get a little water on this one. I'd recommend a little water before this one. So this one, like I said, is quite different, but also in some ways the same. This is a bottled and bond whiskey, just like the one we just tasted. However, this is a blend of those 3 different recipe whiskeys that we make. Now, it says triple mash, so it kind of makes you think that we're blending the mashes together. We're not, right? I know it is a little confusing. Each mash is done separately, distilled separately, aged in the barrel separately. We will blend the whiskey after the aging process, okay, at the very end before we bottle. So let me give you the ratio of how we are blending this triple mash. We start with our rye whiskey recipe. And if you just pick up and nose the triple mash, very different on the nose. There's some sweetness there, but you get an earthiness. There's a mint, kind of an green dill, herbaceous, earthy, spicy. That is that rye whiskey. 60% rye whiskey. That's the base of this, right? Then we layer on 20% of the malt whiskey, 20% of the American single malt. Now, I talked a little bit about the flavor profile of our malt earlier. One of the great things about our malt whiskey that we fell in love with was the mouthfeel, the texture. In the mid-palate, you get that richness, almost a little bread-like, almost like a toasted biscuit, just slightly browned. Sits right in the center of your palate. That's also where the spiciness from the rye comes out as well, right in the center of your palate. So there's this really great tension that goes on between those two spirits. And then the third is Tennessee whiskey. The last 20% is the classic number 7 Tennessee whiskey that will just sweeten it up at the end, right? It's wonderful that you can taste all 3 of these different whiskeys distinctly. I stole that from Lexi, our assistant distiller. She's in the back row. If anybody has any questions for Lexi later, feel free to ask. But I think Lexi actually describes this whiskey beautifully. She says, I love this whiskey neat because you can taste each of the 3 on their own, but they also round together and work together on the palate as well. So enough of me talking. Let's jump in. But on this one, as you sip, as it gets to the mid-palate, I'd like for you to hold it right in the center of your tongue, just for a couple of seconds. Just let it sit there and then finish. Fantastic. You get a touch of that sweetness on the tip of the tongue, but then as it comes back and you hold it in the middle of your tongue, that's where the spiciness of the rye comes out. It really sits down, it goes right out to the edges, right? And you also get that texture, the creaminess, the mouthfeel. There's a richness from that malt that also comes out right in the center And then as you go ahead and swallow, it starts to sweeten up just a little bit from that last 20%, that Tennessee whiskey. This, it's beautiful neat. It's beautiful with a cube of ice. Also, fantastic cocktail whiskey as well. We're super, super excited. This is such a different whiskey with it being a blended bottle and bond whiskey. Again, unlike any other whiskey that we know of that's ever been done in the history of American whiskey. So it's very exciting for us to be able to be here in France and share it with you all. So does anybody have any final questions?
Est-ce qu'il y a des dernières questions? Oui.
Have you guys thought of doing a bottled and bond rye as well?
We have, yes. We should hire you. You're right on it. We are looking with our rye whiskey. I still believe there's lots of potential for different offerings for that. We do some different single barrel stuff with it. We're looking at doing more high proof offerings with it, and certainly a bottle and bond offering with our rye whiskey is something that we would think about as well. I think the bottle and bond at that 50% ABV for really classic spirit forward cocktails, it's such a fantastic ABV to start with, right? And so that's something that we'll certainly consider as we go forward.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was very
Nope,
interesting.
one more. I think there's one more.
Ah,
Sorry.
rapide. Je traduis, vas-y.
Oui, en français, oui. Vous avez éveillé ma curiosité, sans doute notre curiosité. Est-ce qu'on aura la chance de goûter un single malt Jack Daniel?
So I guess you understand the question. We're very curious now to know, is there going to be a single malt Jack Daniels one day?
Yes, there will be single malt Jack Daniel's whiskey coming. Yes, absolutely. Of course, we're calling it American single malt. The big difference there really is the barrel. We're using brand new barrels every single time, virgin barrels every time, toasted and charred. We have it only at 20% here, so this is really the introduction to the world of our American single malt. We've been distilling it since 2013, however. It's been several years. We are going to release a small special release single malt this fall, mostly in the U.S. I'm not sure exactly what all markets it will go to. It'll be a small release as a special release, but we are continuing to focus on how do we get our malt whiskey out to the rest of the world. So that's something that is on Lexi and I's plate. We're going to continue to see what we can do to get our malt whiskey outside of the United States.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. On applaudit, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you.
Et donc, bonne continuation pour le reste du salon. Merci, au revoir.